We've seen this kind of clash of ideologies, if you like, between the US and China, and it plays out, as Seth Sindler has argued, through infrastructure. And we've seen this kind of, the EU recently arguing that China is going to weaponize its ownership of EU's critical infrastructure, things like ports, railways, IT networks, etc., etc. And the kind of counteroffensive at the infrastructure level, there's been lots of other counteroffensive. You see the Build Back Better World in the US, things like the Inflation Reduction Act as a way of kind of investing in technologies to become less reliant on China. And there's a much less impressive program called the Global Gateway at the EU level, which is also about kind of funding infrastructure globally. So this is the kind of the context we're going to talk about today. If I go to the next slide, though, one of the things that my background is international development, and I'd worked for a long time in West Africa. And when China first came, well, it's been in Africa for a very long time, arguably about 500 years, but when it sort of really ramped up in from the turn of the millennium, there was this very unhelpful kind of debate between kind of whether it's a form of imperialism or whether it's this lovely thing called South-South cooperation. That was all lovely, that countries of the developing world were kind of collaborating in a way that was kind of beneficial to all. And I didn't want to get sort of sucked. Could I have the previous slide, please? Keep on that. I didn't want to get sucked into previous slides. I didn't want to get sucked into that kind of debate about whether it was good or bad in that sense. But some interesting things were going on. So China was playing up its colonized past when it went into Africa, saying that we've been colonized too. We understand your pain, kind of thing. So China was playing itself up as a developing country. Yet these Chinese discourses were really ignoring the fact that China had its own land-based empires, there was burgeoning nationalism, that China was really trying to find its place in the world again after 100 years of humiliation. It played up this idea of South-South cooperation, that this is developing countries working together. And within that, infrastructure was very much at the center of that kind of vision. But at the same time, a lot of what the Chinese or some Chinese companies were doing looked very much like kind of neo-colonial extractivism. You put ports in, you put roads in, you put railways in to get iron ore out, to get bauxite out, to get whatever it is you want from Africa. So there was these kind of contradictory things going on. And then, from about 2011, 12, you see a shift, and which is what we're going to focus on today, a shift in investment, not away from Africa per se or from the global south, but a move into Europe. And Europe had been the heart of kind of modernity and kind of the colonial project globally. So this was an interesting thing to sort of think about. Then, well, where and what is development now? Well, I'd got kind of quite fixed lenses on what I thought development was all about, and this has sort of thrown it into question. So one of the questions I want to pose for today's talk, really, and sort of speaking to the school's themes, really, is do we need new theory for these new times, or have the kind of traditional tools, whatever they are, the tools of critical global development, are they still fit for purpose? And I want to start with a couple of things, sort of recent bodies of literature that I think have kind of animated our project, and which we'll talk about in a little more detail. The first is this idea of global development, and it's mooted by this character on the left, Rory Horner. It argues essentially that the geographies that we use for development, you need to redraw the map of global development. And with collaborators, he's talked about this idea of, I always get it wrong, converging divergence. That 100 years ago and up to arguably the 50s or 60s, the differences between countries, the inequalities between countries is very marked. Whereas within countries, inequalities were relatively low. We're now seeing a changing pattern where the inequalities between countries have reduced, other countries have come up, if you like, but within countries you're seeing much more inequality. So, and with things like ecological processes and things like the SDGs, they were arguing, well, actually we need to think in terms of global development, not about north-south kind of development, although we would still focus, they argue, on the global south, but not solely. And what we need to do is move away from these big kind of macro geographical kind of ideas of developing, underdeveloped, north, south, whatever. And they talk about things at a much smaller spatial scale. So as a geographer, looking at kind of individual infrastructure projects that were being bankrolled by China, which was recently a developing country, into Europe, which was the heartland of development, blah, blah, blah. These kind of questions really were quite kind of appealing. I think the critics of this argument, and I'm not going to rehearse them in any detail, essentially, Rory Horner and his colleagues are focusing on the wheres of development, what's happening spatially, what the outcomes of certain processes. They don't really focus or theorize why we're seeing these processes unfolding. And crucially, I think they underplay the role of neoliberalism in those processes. So, you know, the idea that you get a kind of growing inequality within countries may be well due to changes in social policy, in economic policy, in innovation policy, whatever. And these are things about a sort of a deepening of certain kind of neoliberal principles rather than, you know, they just happen by magic or as a result of kind of organic processes. So they kind of, by underplaying that neoliberal impetus, they kind of choose to ignore it to some extent, which is, it was dangerous. But certain things I think we can take from that. If we go to the next slide, another global debate, global China. The character on the right, Qinquan Li, is a professor in California. It's really been championing this, but it's an emerging kind of body of work now around this idea of global China. And it was this really aimed at kind of, or came from sinologists or China studies people who had been studying kind of, you know, Chinese policy, Chinese politics, Chinese economy from a kind of quite internalist perspective. They may look at foreign policy, but not in a kind of relational way about what happens when that foreign policy lands in particular places. And the idea is essentially to understand what China does when China moves beyond its borders, and to get into the kind of empirical details of that. But Qinquan Li is quite, you know, argues, I think, kind of tend to agree that one of the things we need to think about is how those processes are relational. That, you know, we can't understand. There's a big body of work really that seems to treat China as exceptional, that there's something called the China model, there's Chinese capitalism or whatever, and that when this model, this way of organizing the world is exported, that it kind of lands relatively unscathed. And actually her argument, and one we've also argued, is actually you've got to look at the relationships between things going on in China and those places where that investment or whatever it is kind of lands, if you like. Again, a kind of fairly geographical lens, I would argue, on those kind of processes. They also argue, I think, that comparison is really important. So one of the things we see in this literature is that if you treat China as exceptional, then you just look at China for China's sake, and you don't say, well, actually, what China's doing is part of something bigger or has resonances with what the US were doing 50 years ago or whatever, you know. So part of this is to compare what China does with what other actors of different national origins or other periods of time have done. But it's also to compare, you know, there's no such thing as China as an actor. So you've got to also be comparative within those Chinese actors to look at, for example, state-owned enterprises versus private capitalists or whatever. So it's about being much more nuanced in the way we treat this idea of China and what it does when it internationalizes. So if I have the next slide, please. What we were trying to do then in the project is think, well, okay, so what are the kind of things where there's some productive intersections between some of these things? And I think just very quickly, what's driving our kind of theoretical framing of the project Redefine is an idea of thinking much more in terms of a capitalist whole rather than something like the Chinese model of capitalism, or which we get in the kind of varieties of capitalism literature, but nor to look at just micro level geographical outcomes, as Rory Horner says. I think we can look at these structural changes, but also look at how they're manifested at local levels and across scales. As I said, that involves disaggregating both the state and capital. The Chinese state is not one thing. The states which those investors and actors engage with in Hungary or Germany, Greece, whatever, are not one thing. So we need to be much more kind of complex in the way we understand what we mean by Chinese capital and what we mean by the kind of political economy of these processes. As I've said, much more relational. And one of the things I want to focus on today is the way in which kind of ideas about development and about progress are bound up in those kind of types of investment and the narratives we get around those things. Just very quickly, the next slide is the diagram that we're kind of using conceptually to try and frame what we're doing in Redefine. So trying to look at the kind of keep handle, if you like, on both the kind of China end and the kind of where we're looking at in Europe. And I'll come on to those case studies in a little while. And looking at those kind of networked relationships between those, we're focusing on the kind of value chain analysis in a way to look at how those particular investment projects are put together across space, but linking particular places as well. So one of the things that, you know, coming back to Qinquan Li's argument about China internationalizing, you know, there's one of the things we've seen a lot, and again, within geography generally, the geographers, those of us all know David Harvey. A lot of people have used David Harvey's idea of a spatial fix to explain what's going on with China. So this is essentially an argument that China has over accumulated capital and other commodities, cement, steel, and basically a spatial fix is this idea that you export that over accumulation to other geographical locations as a way of staving off a crisis in your own economy. So people just say, well, China's overheated, basically, it needed to find other markets. And that's a kind of persuasive argument, but that's where it's a very capital-centered argument. It's just what the needs of capital are, and there's been some kind of rational decision that that's what happens, and then it happens. What we would argue is it's much messier than that, and there's far more drivers of that overseas investment. And as Chin-Kwon Lee says, and as we would argue, that still doesn't explain what happens when those investments land in particular places. So just want to unpack a little bit in the next slide, kind of what some of the context in terms of what we're talking about in our concrete cases. So essentially, in the first period of China's internationalization, and we can debate when that actually happened, but I mean, there was a reform and opening up in the late 70s. There was this thing called the going out strategy, which was really about accessing natural resources in places, in countries in Africa, in Latin America and Middle East, oil, copper, all these kind of things, which was fueling that kind of construction and industrialization boom in China. Then we had the kind of, so that period was largely about, and infrastructure was bound up in that. One of the things that a lot of the Chinese investments did was to say, we'll barter commodities for loans for infrastructure investment. So classically, you would say we'd take 25 years of oil off you for a loan now, and with that loan you can build a new airport and a new rail network or whatever. Oh, and by the way, we'll build it for you as long as you give us the contract. So there was a kind of win-win-win for the Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, in that period. But then you had the global financial crisis in 2008, and China's stimulus package really pumped a lot of money into its own construction sector. Massive investments in concrete, steel making, and sort of by 3 or 4 years later, there was a massive oversupply in those sectors. So you saw then a push, and a lot of foreign exchange as well, a push between about 2013 to 2017, and you can see it in these spikes in outward investment, that China began to invest into Europe, amongst other places, much more heavily in that period. And if you look at the kind of coloured bars on the right-hand graph, the sort of Air Force bluey colour at the bottom bar of the bar graphs, that's infrastructure. So you see that 70% or so for that period of 2013 to 2017 was in infrastructure. And that's what we're focusing on. So when I put the bid together at the ERC in about 2018, that was the big game in town. It's now, as you've seen, fallen off. We had COVID, didn't help. But there's been a fall off in infrastructure investment. But if you look at the red blobs, all the sort of orangey red, the second bar's up, that is automotive. So the big game, you'll see this now, and Mike Pryke in geography is doing something on this. This is all about battery investment for electrical vehicles. So now the investment patterns have shifted somewhat from China into Europe. We're seeing about 60% of the investment is in EV and new battery factories. Hence, Tata building a new factory potentially in Somerset is part of that process, although it be Indian capital rather than Chinese capital. But as I said, one of the things I want to focus on in all of that is the relationship between kind of those big narratives we talked about at the start of clashing ideologies and kind of civilizational discourses, and China is somehow a threat to the liberal international order. We see a lot of these political narratives, I think, are pitched at the national level. So we see either China versus America, or potentially China versus Europe. I know Europe's not a country. Or we see kind of China-Germany relations. There's a lot of studies of these kind of discourses, and it tends to be very official level discourses. So it's what kind of Donald Trump says, or it's about what Angela Merkel says, or what whoever, Boris Johnson, we'll come on to Boris in a minute, says about these things. So they're essentially elite discourses pitched at the national level, and I think so. It's important, I think, to study those narratives, because narratives do have effects, and one of the things we want to sort of focus on today is how do those narratives play out in terms of the decisions that are made. But that China threat, as I've said, is mostly framed in these kind of civilizational geostrategic terms. And it tends to be much more those elite narratives. And when we're digging into the sort of the political science literature on narratives, a lot of it is about strategic narratives. It's how does Russia portray itself globally, blah, 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 or how does China use, COVID diplomacy to change its image, or how does it use soft power? So these very sort of purposive, strategic, politically elite narratives about how China sees itself, or about how European countries perceive China, etc., etc. And you tend to get those very kind of either or choices that we see about, China's good, China's bad, etc., and which are quite often not very helpful. But those narratives do matter and do stick. And I think, for example, we've seen with the China threat narrative, the whole big debate now about kind of should Europe decouple from China, i.e. cut all its ties. It's now moved on a bit, saying, no, we need to de-risk those ties. It's a bit more nuanced. It's like, well, some of these ties and this interdependence with China is good, but we need to make sure there's no risks for our countries. And that's where the G7 were a few weeks ago when they met in Hiroshima. But I think the danger is that, these narratives become very powerful, and the kind of securitization of China and the securitization of these infrastructure investments becomes very powerful in shaping how countries respond to China. We're going to go into a little more detail like that. But the opposite does play. We have seen very pro-China governments in Hungary and Greece who have used their kind of "we love China" kind of, their turn eastward, their opening eastward strategies to look for more Chinese investment, and that hasn't actually changed. And there's interesting dynamics we'll talk about in a minute about all of that. So we were kind of inspired by this quote on a study of Nepal by in a geography journal by Merton and Lord, saying we need to understand a much more kind of polyphonic kind of understanding of who's narrating these different kind of perspectives. Who are these actors? It's not just these state elites who kind of bring out these kind of big guns of kind of oppositional discourses. So what we're trying to do in this paper, I guess, is to bring into play kind of questions of understanding narratives at different political scales and how those different scalar narratives interplay, rather than just simply focusing on the kind of apocalyptic national narratives of US, China, or whoever, or Europe, China. It's trying to get to a much more variegated set of political narratives. If we could have the next slide, please. And very briefly, so in REDEFINE, we've got these 4 countries which are trying to pick up on that differential sort of economic geography of China and Europe. Things have changed a little bit from this. We've changed one of the case studies. And what we're doing in this paper, if I could have the next slide then, as I said, is to look at a number of cases. Filippo, I've noticed, is here today. Hi, Filippo. We're not going to talk about his case, sorry. But we're going to do 2 from the 4 that we're looking at. So Piraeus in Greece, which is is a sort of part of Athens, really, and the Royal Albert Dock, RAD, which is in the east end of London, and Weiwei and Chen are going to talk about those in a sec. We're in the middle of fieldwork for REDEFINE, so a lot of what we've done, partly why I focus on narratives, is because we were trying to understand these kind of processes through sort of secondary sources, but we have got some interview data to draw on. We're going to go into those case studies now. Ken's going to do Piraeus first, and then Weiwei. So I will hand over to Ken now. Thank you, Ken.
So thank you, Giles. And so today I'm gonna focus on Piraeus case. I'm gonna present you guys 3 different sets of narratives, and to show you how different narratives, all the narratives are embedded in the process of development, and how they constitute the process of investment. So briefly about the Piraeus ports. So the ports actually started in 2008, that the Chinese company COSCO acquired a concession to run the container terminal for 35 years. And then we jump to 2016, that COSCO actually acquired the majority stake of the Piraeus Ports Authority, which is a company affiliated with the Greek state to run the whole port. And then the final bits will be what's happening at the moment. So Of course, during around 2008, there are like three major kind of themes concerning the narratives on Korea's ports. You know, the very first one is the Eurozone crisis. So during that time, you see a lot of kind of narratives concerning about, fighting against the tyranny of Troika. So I've been searching like from the protesters, you've got like no to Troika tyranny, and you've got narratives like Greeks do not negotiate our national dignity. So you've got this kind of playing around basically around that kind of a time. At the same time, another major narrative, strand of narratives is the rise of China. So the whole Costco's event is basically embedded in the narrative and saying the Chinese is rising and trying to take over the world. And at the same time, some of the scholars argue that actually China was at that time the only alternative creditor for investments. And the final one will be the narratives basically from the Costco, the company itself. So Costco actually, through different interviews, Costco basically saying, I quote here, the initial reason to invest Piraeus is because of its own value, which relates to the location, infrastructure, and experience, which you can notice from one of the pictures showing here that Piraeus has easy access to the Southern Europe and Central Europe. However, let's move forward a little bit after the concession agreement in 2016. Costco started to run the whole two periods of the container ports. It has been successful in terms of the rising volume of containers. So you will notice, from the national level, from both the Chinese and the Greek side, you see the praises, you see some of the very positive narratives and arguing that this is a wise choice for the Chinese to come here. And so from the President Xi Jinping in 2016, basically saying, we are going to build Piraeus ports as an important container transit port, basically a home port to ship the Chinese goods to Piraeus and then to the rest of the Europe. And then you have the national leaders from the Greek government appraising, saying this is beneficial for both sides. And of course, as Giles mentioned, the general mood here, the general opinion of the public in Greece is positive about the Chinese. However, you do have other kind of alternative narratives that are emergent, so mostly are from the EU leaders and from other Western European countries. So one of the members of the European Parliament, so she argued that EU. The Greek government should rethink the Chinese investment. The EU is not just simply a single market, but more importantly, it is the community of values. And also you have other like German foreign ministers and some other people also argue, saying we have to speak with China in one voice. So, as I said, we move from this national kind of international kind of narratives. So we're looking at what's happening now or in the process. So from the very beginning, from what I've interviewed, both sides, from the Chinese and the Greek governments, they have high expectations and peak at around 2017. The President Xi Jinping argued it is the dragon head of the China's Belt and Road Initiative. But nowadays, the expectations are much lower from both sides. What I present to you is the what's happening on the ground, what's happening at the local level. So one of the things we notice is after the Costco takeover, you have a lot of strikes fighting for the casualization of labor rights, and you have actually Dockworks argue this is not a concession, this is a gave way. One thing I want to emphasize is, of course, the casualization of labor rights is not Chinese. It's more of the whole industry in terms of like logistics, like transports, they all have that kind of a phenomenon. And of course, you know, there are other issues concerning about the Chinese investment. So you have environmentalists argue that the Chinese investment has been polluting the area and damage some of the sites with archaeological significance. And with talking, me and my colleague Philip been talking to local officials as well, and they argue that actually the benefits is not distributed evenly in this area, and the whole port covers 4 municipalities. At least one of the municipality, the mayor told us they don't have access to Costco at all, like zero access. So from these kind of narratives are showing, what I want to show you is they complicate the process. So for instance, we notice the master plan designed by Costco has been rejected several times, basically around 2015, and it was approved only early this year. And then you have a lot of legal fights and trying to slow down the Costco's investments. So the whole picture, what we want to demonstrate and show you guys is narratives are important for us to understand the process, especially those related to the national level. However, what's going on at the local level are complicates the whole process, and at the same time and slow down or even block the whole investment. So that's the picture I want to show you with regards to the case. Now I'll pass this to Weiwei to talk about the rat case.
Okay, thank you. Now moving to the UK cases, and one of the prominent cases is the London's Royal Albert Dock. It is a Chinese-backed enterprises zone in the UK. It's supposed flagship China-UK project to be a gateway for other Chinese businesses, mainly businesses and banking, to focus on the UK and the European markets during that time, start from 2012-13 onwards. It's set to develop in an existing derelict site in East London. This project promises significant social economic contributions, particularly employment opportunities for local residents, with claims of creating 20,000 to 30,000 new jobs. The RED project aligned with the pro-China stance of the early 2010s Conservative government under Prime Minister David Cameron and the Chancellor George Osborne, a period being often referred to as the Golden Age. These efforts also mark China's intent to showcase its leadership in infrastructure development. Notably, Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, was the mayor of London during that period, and the UK devolution agenda saw elected mayor as the figureheads for more streamlined planning provisions designed to encourage the speed of inward investment to their respective cities. And the RED Enterprises Zone project aligned well with this kind of devolution agenda. As the Boris Johnson claimed that this deal symbolizes the revival of that great area, continuing the reinvention of this once marginalized part of the capital into a 21st century center of trade and investment. So creating a third financial district in the capital. This development will act as a beacon for Eastern investors looking west, bringing with its tens of thousands of jobs and billions of pounds of investment for the UK economy. Well, during this period, the narrative of anticipation and futurity surrounding this project has sparked significant excitement and optimism. Next slide, please. However, the narrative had been changed since then. Critical infrastructure was triggered for reduced enthusiasm toward China. Notably, one of the examples was the involvement of Huawei in the rollout of the 5G network and the Hinkley Point nuclear plant, much of which were driven by the pressure from the United States. And the result was that from 2017 onwards, main political parties weaponized China. We can observe some kind of differences between political actors and public. Next slide, please. For instance, as claimed that the British public and the political perception of China in 2020 were predominantly negative and deteriorated significantly over the previous few years. In November 2022, this sentiment was formally acknowledged by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Sunak even also declined the so-called golden age of UK-China relations officially over, stating, "We recognize China poses systematic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more accurate as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism." While the ABP-led RED project failed, and nothing much happened until April 2023, when New Buyer founded. So here the question really is this just a case of geopolitics interfering in investment decision, or is this more complicated than that? So really, we need to look at multiple scales and various actors involved in this kind of development. There were accusations, for instance, around the role of the Great London Authority and Boris Johnson being very pro-China when he was a mayor, and also a coincidence with the time that the deal was signed. One of the issues was around ABP's capitalization of the project, as well as possibly close links between Boris Johnson and the developer, Mr. Hu Weiwei prior to the tender. The inquiry, however, never happened and was dismissed as the Great London Authority labeled cookers seeking to play politics, but later concerns proved real. In addition, they also have other factors affected the poor performance of the RED case. For instance, the availability of the RED and investment were affected significantly to a certain extent by the Brexit and the COVID pandemic. In addition, the connectivity in East London, where RED is located, was still not great, which ABP cited as the reason for the project's poor performance. In addition, ABP is alleged to have misjudged the London's commercial property market by initially by marketizing the Chinese investor to sell the whole building to them. Eventually, they found the Chinese investor only want a floor or even half floor of the building. In addition, one interviewee suggests that ABP simply wanted rationale to export capital from China, and so was less interested in the success of RED. In addition to this, the political economic conditions in China also matter. For instance, other Chinese investors selling out in the wake of property bubble busting in China and needing to raise capital cooped with Beijing's squeeze on the property sector, particularly after the end of 2016. So in this sense, relational regulation also matters. Now can move to the slide, next slide, and move to Giles for the analysis and the conclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Weiwei. So yeah, I mean, so what we hopefully got the sense of what we're trying to do is, you know, when you approach this from these narratives and these kind of processes from a particular perspective as captured in those narratives, you get a particular worldview, which, while helpful in a kind of macro geoeconomic and geopolitical sense, you know, picks up on certain tensions and partial realities that may or may not be evident. I think what we tried to do is say, well, if you take a much more multi-actor, multi-scalar approach, you counter those kind of realist interpretations of kind of nations against nations or superpowers versus superpowers, and you get this much kind of more messy kind of sense of what's going on. And while I think you can you know, interrogate political narratives on their own terms. It's important because of the normative desires and the effects that they have. These aren't just, it's not just a kind of nice exercise in looking at discourse. These things do have real effects in certain ways, although not always in the kind of causality is not always straightforward or dead clear. And I think, you know, in terms of wider kind of political projects, I think it's important to sort of open up these narratives to other voices, partly because, you know, this quote from Beckett and Bronk, you know, their argument is that, you know, the narratives that come to dominate our kind of worldviews reflect kind of corporate power, state power, and that if you kind of puncture those narratives, you begin to get, as they've said, different visions of the future. And that if we have that kind of evidence, then you know, I mean, it's a nice liberal kind of view that you'll calmly debate them and we can make rational decisions about what works and what doesn't work. I mean, I'm not that kind of optimistic, I guess, but at least I think kind of foregrounding those narratives gives us one way to sort of have that discussion and look at how these things might play out and what alternatives there may be. Just to finish very quickly, I mean, I opened the talk with, well, do we need kind of new theories for new times or old theories for old times? And I think, you know, I brought up on kind of critical development studies, sort of neo-Marxian development studies, critical international political economy, and I think it still does have a lot to offer. I think, you know, trying to understand this idea of a variegated political economy as opposed to kind of the varieties of capitalism argument that says there's a Chinese capitalism, a German capitalism, seeing it as a systemic level has been really helpful. People, and you know, the work we've drawn on people like Bob Jessup, Neil Brenner, Gillian Hart, Neil Smith, but going back further to, you know, to Lenin, etc. And I think that, you know, in our school, the work that Will Brown's doing on combined and uneven development, waiting for his new book, you know, is really helpful, I think, in trying to understand these kind of processes of kind of development at a global level and at multiple scales. I think the idea that you get from that partly is around kind of processes of peripherization and multiple cores and multiple peripheries. So thinking about the Greek case that we've just looked at, you know, Greece is, you know, in one sense has been a disappointment for Europe. It was the cradle of democracy, and yet, you know, the Troika essentially argued it, you know, treated it like a, you know, an African state in the 1980s. You fail state, we need to, you know, privatize the hell out of you, kick out all these kind of ghost workers, make you pay taxes and behave like a proper European state. So I think, you know, the peripherization of Greece within Europe is long and festering. Along comes the Troika, along comes China. You know, Greece now plays off China against the EU in the way that, in similar ways that Hungary, Viktor Orban also has this opening east policy, and he's quite antagonistic to the kind of, you know, the liberal values of the EU as he sees it. So I think it's interesting to look at how these state discourses play into these wider processes, but also using infrastructure as one way in which you get into some of those big tensions. And I think it's interesting because I think, you know, the old Cold War narratives, it was kind of about spheres of influence that you have, you know, you try and bring people on the side. What's interesting about the infrastructure as a connectivity under a new Cold War kind of narrative, if you like, is that this is much more about connecting places. And as I think one of the interesting things to watch out then is, right, that opening slide was, well, you've got, you know, these American programs now, Inflation Reduction Act, Build Back Better World, you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, you've got the, you know, the Global Gateway. How are these different contesting kind of geopolitical visions embodied in infrastructure going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years, which I guess that's the next grant that we're going to go for. So thank you very much.